Welcome in, everyone, and thank you for listening to the 150th ever episode of the Missouri Sports Podcast, brought to you by 106 Apparel and recording from the Revel Advertising Studio in beautiful Springfield, Missouri. I'm one of your hosts, Cameron Albert, alongside my good friend and fellow Mizzou fan, Kyle DeVries. How are you doing today, Kyle?
I'm great, Cameron. How are you? I'm
doing well. I've got Drew Lock here next to me. I have never had like this much access to our Drew Lock bobblehead.
Put up in a new spot.
And yeah, it's very nice having him here. I might even have him look at me a little bit.
He has to win the starting job for the Denver Broncos so that he can remain a relevant staple of our podcast.
Then I don't know if it's going to work out then.
Okay, he doesn't have to win the job.
I don't want our listeners mad at me, but I don't know. If he can't beat out Teddy Bridgewater for that starting job in Denver,
it's not looking good.
No, I don't.
He'll win it. He'll be fine.
I don't want that to happen for our guy, Drew. Kyle, what have you been up to?
Oh, well, I was going to say nothing, but then I remembered something very significant. And I started a Heisman campaign, or whatever it's called, on NCAA 14. I got it in the mail. I paid a premium penny for it, but I'm going to play that sucker. Oh, yeah. I tell you what.
Get your money's worth.
And I'm a Missouri Tiger.
Wow.
I was like
Shocker.
I was like a top 5 recruit in the country.
Wow. Offers from everyone?
Offers from everyone as a running back.
He stayed home.
Stayed home, just like everybody in real life, right?
And they should.
And like 4 games into my freshman season, I took Henry Josie's job as a starting running back.
Well,
looking pretty, I mean, that's pretty realistic, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I felt kind of bad. I'm like returning kickoffs instead of Marcus Murphy. I'm just dealing like all these legends. They're just taking their jobs.
Yeah. Is that like what would have happened if Ezekiel Elliott went to Mizzou?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Probably.
NCAA 14 is one of the best video games of all time, in my opinion. I've played hundreds of hours of it, literally, and just can't beat it, except I hope they're able to beat it when they come out with whatever the new college football video game is.
Can't wait.
That would be awesome.
They made, we were talking about this earlier, they made James Franklin such a beast in that game, and I feel like
he was a beast.
Well, of course, but that's one thing I really noticed about this game. I played some of the older versions of the game, but they really took some time and looked at what the actual players looked like on the roster and tried to imitate their game. And
to their detriment. They were using their likeness, and that kind of backfired on them.
Exactly right. But James Franklin, man, he's good.
Oh, yeah. Frank the Tank. Kyle, we need to address something from last week. We had a very important question posed to us in our YouTube comments, and that was from Jack Schultz. He said, quote, "What does the guy do that's on his computer the whole time?" I think he's referring to producer Cameron.
Oh, my God. I just now noticed there's somebody sitting there.
I said, great question. We'll ask him next episode. He just came in and sat down one day, and we don't have the heart to make him leave.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. But in all seriousness, what do you do around here?
Well, when we record, usually I'm browsing the internet or just looking up random stuff.
Okay.
He's research department.
Yeah.
He's adding value.
Right.
But okay, so when we're actually recording, I don't do a lot. But after we record, I'm putting together the video. I do all the graphics for the episode.
Yep.
And
he's responsible for this beautiful logo. If you're watching on YouTube, our Missouri State outline logo that we love so much, patent pending.
Also, where I work for my real job is the building that we record in.
That is true.
That's also how we have the hookup.
Yes, that is makes all of this possible even more than Kyle and I's voices.
And he's a dear friend.
If we didn't have, well, yeah, that too. If we didn't have microphones, Kyle and I would just still be talking to each other. Nobody would be listening.
How it got started.
Yeah. All right, so glad we got that question answered. That was, I think there were several viewers really wanting to know what was going on there. So that is the answer to that. We've got more football to talk about, believe it or not. Before we do that, don't forget to check us out on YouTube. If you're listening audio only, that may have been a confusing little segment right then. So we referenced a lot of the of our physical surroundings. So go check us out on YouTube. Leave us a comment, just like Jack Schultz did. Also, big announcement, big shout out, first of all, to our new Patreon supporter, Ryan. Shout out to Ryan. Thank you so much. We appreciate you.
Thank you, Ryan.
And also to our supporter, Britt, for not being a new supporter, but increasing his pledge on Patreon to get some more perks. Appreciate you, Britt. And that leads me into an announcement. We are, for the first time ever, doing a Missouri Sports Podcast Fantasy Football League. Now, there is an entry fee. You do have to sign up on Patreon to the $10 tier or above by the end of August, by August 31st, so that we can get our fantasy football draft going. And you do get a prize. The winner gets a prize. Now, historically, Kyle and I are pretty good at these, inter-podcast competitions and things. So you better bring your A game.
Mm-hmm.
But sign up on Patreon, $10 tier or above, by the end of August. We'll draft early September. Winner gets a prize mailed to you. And then we're also going to have a plaque in the podcast studio. Will be visible every episode. And that'll be kind of like a running list of all the winners year after year. So we definitely want to keep this thing going over time, develop a nice little league. And if you stay in that tier, you'll also get access to our Discord server where we're talking about Mizzou, and that's where we'll do a lot of fantasy football communications. And of course, if you continue your subscription on Patreon past the fantasy football season, you will get merch sent to you at that tier. So all of that kind of stuff can be yours if you sign up to play fantasy football with us this upcoming season.
Yeah, obviously we love Mizzou, but we also are very enthusiastic about fantasy football and NFL, so we have a lot of fun playing that. So we thought that would be a really fun way to interact with some of you guys, and I don't know, see if you can take us on. So we'll be looking forward to it.
Maybe even producer Cameron will play.
Easy win every week.
All right, Kyle. So we've got a little bit of news, and then our topic of the show this week is football recruiting, specifically Kansas City, Missouri area football recruiting for the past few years. We're going to kind of look at some wins in recruiting, some misses in recruiting, and just kind of how Kansas City has treated Mizzou football in the past few seasons. But before we do that, a little bit of news. SEC Media Days is next week. Mizzou football representatives Akale Byers and Case Cook will be present.
I was a little bit surprised by that, but I guess when I think about it, they're both seniors.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of thought that Connor Bazelak would represent Missouri, but I totally understand why Coach sent the seniors.
Mizzou made the top 5 for a Michigan football prospect, Dion Walker.
Yeah, this is a 4-star offensive lineman from Cass Tech in Detroit. He's just a measly 6'7", 356.
That'll play.
He will probably play offensive line in college. And the other 4 schools that he named were Michigan, Georgia, Arizona State, and Kentucky. I think it's down to Missouri and Michigan, but we shall see.
And then Missouri got a commitment recently. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, Jalen Marshall is the newest commitment to Missouri's 2022 class. He's a defensive tackle from Overland Park in Kansas, so basically the Kansas City area. And that's kind of what brought us the idea to what we're going to talk about later in the podcast, was just Kansas City recruiting in general. But Jalen Marshall, 6'5", 275. He is ranked as the number 6 overall prospect in Kansas, according to Rivals. I think he's a little bit under-recruited and a little bit under-ranked. I feel like I tend to say that about a lot of our guys probably, but I was really surprised by Jalen's ability to move, and he's really good in quarterback pursuit. He's got long arms, so he was batting down passes all over the place in his film, so moves really well for nearly 300 pounds and 6'5", so just generally making life difficult for the quarterback constantly, so that was something I really like to see. He kind of came onto the scene a little bit later than normal for guys that, a lot of times you got to battle for these recruits for an entire year sometimes or longer. But Jalen Marshall, the coaches invited him to come work out on campus last month, and I think Indiana was his current leader at the time, and he kind of just came in without expectations, but really liked what he saw. Came back a little bit later on an official visit last month in June, and I think that's when he knew that he wanted to come to Mizzou. So pretty cool story, and he gave some good insights on some interviews about that process and kind of his thoughts on his decision making. So welcome to the class, Jalen Marshall.
Yeah, he also had offers from, like you said, Indiana, but also Nebraska, Oklahoma State, and Arizona State, according to 24/7 Sports. One thing that caught my ear when you were kind of describing the process is this is not the first player of the 2022 class that Missouri has offered, and then very quickly they sign up to play for Missouri. I mean, it seems like there's been a handful of players that have kind of not been talked about that much in Mizzou circles, and then all of a sudden they are visiting and get an offer and then are committed like a month later.
Yeah, and you can't always do that depending on what program you are, but I really think that Missouri just has that big splash ability right now where they're repping that SEC, and they have a lot of their defensive coaches have coached in the NFL. They have a lot of impressive things to show off to recruits right now, and I think that is a result of having some of those recruits that you get them in without real big expectations. They love what they see, and they're on board quickly.
Yeah.
And we haven't seen that as much in the past. So
it's pretty cool. I mean, when you look at that offer list, that doesn't, no other SEC schools, but this is where you want Missouri to be. If Missouri is the first SEC school in on a guy, and they, are ready to bring him on board, and it's not a long, drawn-out process, I mean, that's exactly what you would hope for in that situation. If Missouri wants to be recruiting with the big boys, you do not want to be in recruiting battles with, producer Cameron, Nebraska and Indiana and Arizona State. You want to be differentiating yourself from those schools and saying an offer from Mizzou means something different.
Right. And at this point in time, it really does feel like Missouri's put themselves in a tier above some of those schools that maybe I wouldn't have thought that at all maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Yeah. I definitely would have thought that we were on the same plane as some of those other schools that he had offers from. But right now, things are a little elevated over where they've been in the past. If you listen to this podcast, or if you paid attention at all, you probably could have figured that out.
Recruiting's going pretty well, if you didn't know.
Yeah.
Hopefully it will continue.
A little bit of hype.
Is that all for news that's happened this week? I think that's about it.
That's all I thought of. Okay. So there's probably something else, but
yeah, well,
what can you do?
Let's talk about Kansas City. So yeah, perfect segue. Jalen Marshall from the Kansas City area, adding to a stellar 2022 recruiting class for Mizzou football. And so Kyle had the idea to kind of look back historically at how Kansas City has treated Mizzou football.
Yeah, well, I realized, this class, we're probably halfway through the class as far as who's going to be on that final commit list. And we already have 4 players committed from Kansas City or from that area. And it kind of feels like Kansas City's been a little quiet in recent years in Mizzou's recruiting class. And it just feels like, we've historically not recruited St. Louis real well. But honestly, in the last few years, Kansas City's probably been worse as far as just the talent that we've been able to get.
Yeah, I was going to say St. Louis kind of is on the top of everybody's mind as it's hard to recruit St. Louis. The top players from St. Louis go to big schools, and Missouri hasn't had success. But Kansas City is nearly equally as important, and Missouri has struggled just as bad, if not worse.
Yeah, and so I went back and looked at the last 10 years of recruiting classes, and I would say that St. Louis still just a sheer number of players. There's probably more talent quantity-wise still coming out of St. Louis year after year than Kansas City.
Would you say that the top is better coming out of St. Louis?
Maybe just a little bit, but there's still a ton of talent coming out of Kansas City every single year, so... I guess I thought it would be kind of cool just to go back to 2012 was the first year I went back to. And so for every year, I looked at how many players from Kansas City joined Mizzou's class. And then I looked at who did we miss? Who were some of those top players from Kansas City that year that went on to be significant somewhere else, or maybe they didn't amount to much. But yeah, so I figured we would just start with 2012 actually, and look at some of those years with Gary Pinkel, where you can definitely see a trend that Gary Pinkel prioritized the in-state recruits. And whenever we get to that 2015 range or so, whenever Barry Odom comes onto the scene, you will definitely see a change in the pattern there as far as the talent we are getting out of Kansas City. But we will jump to 2012. So this will be kind of fun for some of you who have been following recruiting for a really long time. You might hear some names you haven't thought of in a while, and that was definitely the case for me when I was looking through some of these classes. It was like, man, these are some guys I have not heard about in a really long time. But in 2012, Missouri landed 2 players from Kansas City. That was Evan Boehm and Morgan Stewart, who are both, I believe, 4-star players. Pretty promising guys. Obviously, Evan Boehm was very important to Missouri's success a few years later. But 2 names they missed on that year. They missed, and these are, when I say these rankings, they're going to be the Missouri rankings according to 24/7.
Just for the state of Missouri.
Just for the state of Missouri. But they missed on number 2, Andre Pipkins, and he went to Michigan. And they missed on the number 7 recruit, Michael Rose Ivy, who went to Nebraska. And we're a little bit younger. I do definitely remember Missouri recruiting in 2012, but I don't remember either one of those 2 players specifically. So I don't know that they went on to do too much at those respective schools. You have anything to add on 2012?
Yeah, I mean, just seeing Evan Boehm there, just, one of the staples of a couple of Missouri's best teams ever. And Morgan Stewart was a guy that kind of had some hype coming into Mizzou and just never could really stay healthy and got passed up on the depth chart because of that. And, I think could have been a very good running back for Missouri and just never really could stay healthy and get out on the field and get the opportunity.
Yeah, that was always tough to watch. Was just seemed like a really good kid, really obviously very talented, and just never could quite see the field consistently.
Of course, not Kansas City related at all, but the big prize in that recruiting class for Missouri was one Dorial Green Beckham.
Yes.
That's a conversation for another day, but
you
can't talk about the 2012 recruiting class without mentioning his name.
For sure. Number 1 recruit, not only, of course, in Missouri, but number 1 overall recruit in the nation, Dorial Green Beckham. All right, we'll move on to 2013. A little bit more action in this class. There was four players from Kansas City that went to Mizzou: Anthony Sherrills, Trent Hosick, Clay Rhodes, and Charles Harris. Who they missed on? They missed on number 3, Nick Ramirez, who went to K-State, and they missed on number 8, Malik Collins, who went to Nebraska. So still at this time, we were definitely still losing recruits to some of those neighboring schools like Nebraska, Iowa. Definitely something that I don't think is happening as much in the current era. But obviously Anthony Sherrills, Charles Harris were 2 guys that really stuck out as big time players at Mizzou. Charles Harris was kind of a late speculative ad that just ended up blowing up. So that was, he was the poster child for one of those like borderline unranked players that you were like, who is this guy? And just ends up being an NFL player.
Yeah, had the the measurables and the athleticism, but was just super raw and needed to be coached up, and it really worked.
Yep. All right, we'll move on to 2014. Same thing. We had 4 players from Kansas City that went to Mizzou: Kendall Blanton, Michael Fairchild, Logan Cheadle, and Kevin Pendleton.
Kyle, I got to back you up for a sec. Give me your list again on 2013 from Kansas City.
Anthony Sherrills, Trent Hosick, Clay Rhodes, Charles Harris.
Hosick.
Yeah.
I could have sworn it was Hosick.
Pretty sure it was Hosick, but I have no idea. I wouldn't bet any money on it. But I know there's listeners out there that would be able to tell us.
Number 16 dual threat quarterback in the country that season.
Yeah.
Man. And
he was a good athlete. I think he was really good at another sport, like wrestling or something like that. Like he was a good athlete, but never really got to play at Mizzou.
It's so interesting to me. I mean, I we'll see this in different positions, but the quarterback position especially. It's so interesting when a guy clearly wants to be at Mizzou. Like he didn't. this wasn't, he didn't just come to Mizzou because it was the hometown or the home state school and he had nowhere else to go. Like, he could have gone and played Division I quarterback somewhere else, but he stayed home and tried to win the starting job and just couldn't quite make it happen.
Yep. 2014, 4 players from Kansas City went to Mizzou: Kendall Blanton, Michael Fairchild, Logan Cheadle, and Kevin Pendleton. A notable miss was the number 6 ranked Monte Harrison, who went to Nebraska. And I actually watched him play live. I guess that would have been his senior year in 2014. He actually, I think he ended up playing baseball and went into like the major leagues or something like that. So I don't know how effective he actually was for Nebraska, but at the time it felt like a miss. I feel like Kevin Pendleton's probably the most memorable name on this list as far as Mizzou players that year. Obviously,
Still with the program.
He was kind of a staple of that offensive line. Kendall Blanton was definitely a talented tight end that never quite seemed to reach his potential, but ended up making an NFL roster. And
made some incredible plays in Mizzou uniform.
Yeah, it seemed like he would always have those just insane catches sometimes, like one-handed catches.
Yeah, it seemed like he definitely had all the physical tools to be like an elite tight end at the college level, but for some reason never could quite put it together. Logan Cheadle, that's a name. Yeah, famous last name.
Yes.
He never really broke through the defensive back depth chart.
Yeah, he played a decent amount, but I don't ever really remember it being terribly memorable. 2015. Now, this was an interesting class here because we've got Drew Lock and a bunch of other names that never really played at all. But this was definitely Gary Pinkel's. He had the most players from Kansas City in this class in his tenure, and that was 6 players. Drew Lock obviously was kind of the crown jewel of that class, but A.J. Harris, Marquise Doherty, Josh Moore, Ryan Williams, and Tanner Owen were the other guys in that class. And A.J. Harris, really promising 4-star offensive lineman who kind of dealt with injuries and didn't play a whole lot in his time at Mizzou. Marquise Doherty, I don't think he ever really played. I think he was kind of a dual sport athlete and played baseball. And some of these names you don't really remember much about them, but we also missed on the Davis brothers that year. The number 4, Carlos Davis, number 6, Khalil Davis. They both went to Nebraska.
Those names familiar to you, Producer Cameron?
Not really, no.
We were losing a lot of recruits to Nebraska in those earlier years.
Glad that's not happening anymore. Drew Lock. We got to maybe linger a moment on that name. One of the biggest recruiting wins, and it was so nice to just kind of have that in the bag. There was not really much worry in my mind about Drew Lock's college decision with the family lineage and just the way Mizzou made him a priority. And it was just obvious that he was meant to be the future starting quarterback of Missouri Tigers. And historically, for lots of schools, that family lineage, especially quarterback, where it's okay, this guy is just literally born to be the starting quarterback at this school for multiple reasons. That doesn't always work out so well. No. And I would say Drew Lock performed admirably in that role and was probably held back a little bit by coaching and lack of recruiting in these following 2 seasons that made his life a little bit more difficult as a junior and senior. But he, I think, did the best he could with what he had and he had some eye-popping numbers in his college career.
Oh yeah, he will always be remembered for that. I feel like he was so talented, able to put up crazy numbers for sure. Didn't always translate to wins.
Right, and right after his career ended, I think the not getting a very many or more than one signature win in his career was more at the forefront of my mind, at least. And now with a little bit more time removed, you kind of start to forget about those big losses that could have been signature wins, and you just kind of think about the career as a whole. And, it's a lot prettier when you think about it that way.
Yeah. So that was Gary Pinkel's last class as far as like him recruiting. So in the years that we just looked at, 2012 had 2 players in Kansas City. 2013 and 2014 both had 4 players in Kansas City. And then in his last year, 2015, they had 6 players from Kansas City. Now we're obviously moving into the Barry Odom era. Things looked a little bit differently on in-state recruiting once we got to that era. And in 2016, we had 1 player from the Kansas City area that went to Mizzou. However, that we did have only 1, but it was a very memorable player, and that was Cale Garrett. We did miss on some significant talent in state that year. We missed on number 1 ranked AJ Taylor, who went to Wisconsin and was a good running back there.
He actually transitioned to wide receiver and had 66 catches for 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns.
Oh, wow.
As a senior.
Wow. And then number 2, now you can probably argue a little bit whether some of these were misses or not, and whether really Mizzou pursued these players, but they did miss on number 2, Skylar Thompson, who had a good career at Kansas State as a quarterback. And then they missed on number 8, Bo Wilson, who went to Nebraska. So pretty stark difference from 2015, six guys, obviously Drew Lock being one of those, to 1 player in 2016. And at the time, Cale Garrett was not a very impressive get. I think he was ranked like 25th in the state. So
we talked about a little bit last week about Barry Odom's linebacker whispering and how he was able to just extract every little bit of talent that his main guy at linebacker possessed, and just make the most of it. Even super unheralded recruits, he was able to make it happen. So that obviously happened with Cale Garrett.
Yeah, Cale Garrett originally committed to Navy and then did a last-minute switch to Mizzou whenever he got that offer.
AJ Taylor's an interesting one, though, because, obviously he had a productive career at Wisconsin, and is that maybe the type of player that I'm talking about that Drew Lock was missing as a part of the offense. A guy that would have stuck around for 4 seasons and contributed. I think that was sorely missed. Basically just to kind of round out the offense a little bit better. We needed, a couple more players like that along the way.
Yeah, for sure. All right, well, we're getting a little closer to the modern era, I guess you could call it. But
this is pretty modern for most folks out there.
Yeah. 2017 was a pretty ugly year, about as ugly as it can possibly get for in-state recruiting. Mr. Barry Odom got Deron Davis as his only in-state recruit that year. Deron Davis was from Kansas City, but like I said, only in-state recruit in the entire class was Deron Davis, who I don't even believe he ever made it to campus.
Yeah.
I can't even wrap my mind around how that's possible.
That's insane.
Yeah, out of a 20-plus person class, that only one of them was from the state of Missouri. Obviously, that cannot happen and probably will never happen again.
Yeah, I would like to see, going back, obviously the recruiting services only record stuff going back so far, but man, that's got to be the only, I can't imagine there's another time where Missouri had a recruiting class that resulted in 0 snaps played by a player from the state of Missouri.
Yeah, that's pretty bad. Misses from that class was number 1 ranked Chester Graves. He went to Ole Miss. He was definitely a guy I really wanted to get at the time. Of course, I remember that. And they also missed on number 6, Anthony Payne, who went to Kansas State. All right, 2018 was a pretty significant year for recruiting. That was the notorious Tiger 10 year. That was a busy year for Barry Odom. That definitely felt like his chance to redeem himself from some pretty lackluster recruiting from the previous years. This felt like the most talent, at the time at least, it felt like the most talent that we'd seen in Missouri in a really, really long time. And obviously 10 guys in the state that just were easily high D1 prospects.
Yeah,
borderline from the get-go.
Like either solidly 4-star prospects or borderline 3 to 4-star prospects.
Right, and we could probably do a whole episode on this 1 year of the Tiger 10, but we'll try to keep it brief.
There's a lot of St. Louis in there, so
yeah, that's true. But Missouri landed 2 players from Kansas City that year. That was Daniel Parker Jr., who was a part of the Tiger 10, and then they also landed Dominic Jacinto. The 2 players from Kansas City area that they did miss were it was number 4, Mario Goodrich, who went to Clemson, and I believe he's still there in the secondary there. And then they missed on number 9, Daniel Carson, who went to Texas, and then I believe he announced a transfer in the last year, and I'm not really sure where he ended up. But that was definitely the thing about the Tiger 10 was it felt like a failure at the time. They didn't land very many of those players, obviously, but it didn't really feel like many of those players went on to have very successful careers. Obviously, Ronnie Perkins was the complete opposite. He ended up having an incredible career at Oklahoma and is now a New England Patriot, I believe. And he was the one guy at the time I felt like we got to get this guy. He was the best of the 10, I felt like, and then ended up having the best career in college. But for the most part, I feel like a lot of those guys just didn't end up. They were injured, or they didn't really end up, getting a lot of playing time wherever they went.
Daniel Carson transferred to Western Illinois.
Thank you.
From Texas.
Yeah, that's a pretty big drop off going from Texas to Western Illinois.
Yeah, no, I like your idea though about maybe spotlighting the Tiger 10 and doing deep dives into where they all ended up and how their careers went. Not to, bash anybody for not being as successful as people thought, but just how make or break that class ended up being for Mizzou. Maybe we can look back at it and say, well, imagine we landed every single one of these guys. Would it have made that much of a difference for Barry Odom's career? Maybe, but without doing that deep dive, I would lean towards probably not.
Yeah, I think I agree with you.
Daniel Parker Jr. obviously still on the roster.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Dominic Jacinto transferred about a year ago or so.
Daniel Parker Jr. with an opportunity to have a lot of snaps at the tight end position.
Yeah,
somebody's gonna have snaps between him, Nico Hay, the incoming freshman. It's
wide open.
Yeah. Need somebody to catch passes, please.
Yes, please. Okay, so 2019, man, that was a pretty quiet year comparatively to 2018. We did not land a player from Kansas City that year. A significant miss was Itanosa Rubin. He was the number 8 ranked player in Missouri, and he went to Clemson.
The state of Missouri that year just stacked with good players out of St. Louis.
Oh, yeah. Was that was like Mookie Cooper year, I believe? Or is that 2020?
That's 2020, I think. 19 was Jamison Williams, Marcus Washington, Shamon Cooper, Jelani Williams from St. Louis.
And another quiet year for Missouri on the recruiting trail, at least in Kansas City, was 2020. That was obviously Barry Odom's last season that he recruited, and I believe was that the year Eli Drinkwitz would have been there for signing day, but he wasn't there for most of the time they were recruiting this class. Like I said, 0 players from Kansas City. The number 1 player in Missouri that year was from Kansas City, and that was Dante Manning, and he
5-star.
5-star. He went to Oregon. All right, 2021. We did not have a player from Kansas City. We missed on Bo Stevens, who was the number 4 ranked recruit in Missouri. He went to Iowa. And then we missed on number 7, Tobeki Okilai.
Sounds good to me.
And he went to Auburn. So that brings us to where we are right now. That brings us to the class of 2022. It's yet to be finished. But 4 players from Kansas City on board so far. Mecky Miller, Armand Mimbao, Max Wisner, and now Jalen Marshall. So
getting things turned around a little bit.
Right.
Obviously, you have to have the players there in the caliber that Missouri wants to be recruiting in the first place, but they're there this year, and Coach Drinkwitz is making them a priority and getting them signed.
Yeah, I will
Hopefully.
say, things obviously took a pretty significant drop off whenever Barry Odom was here, but I do think that there was a little bit less overall talent coming out of Kansas City in some of the years that he was here. But I still think that he just did not capitalize on the talent in Missouri as well as he could have.
Yeah, the 2020 season, Dante Manning was such a good prospect. I mean, number 31 in the nation.
Right.
And he went all the way to Oregon. And, obviously still there, still going to attempt to make a name for himself there. But he's a guy that, we wouldn't be so worried about the cornerback depth at Mizzou this coming season. Tulsa transfers aside, if we knew that Dante Manning was kind of waiting in the wings to take over a starting job.
Yeah, you can definitely. It's fun to go through some of these older recruiting classes, and it's fun to see significant players that ended up, playing a massive role at Mizzou. But as crazy as it is, it seems like a lot of these players didn't end up really making an impact either. And it's crazy to look at Mizzou's recruiting class right now and think that half of these guys will barely remember their names 10 years from now. It's kind of crazy to think about.
Yeah.
Because they all just seem so promising and so talented, and they are talented, but sometimes just certain things happen and certain players flourish and others don't. But it's very interesting to go down memory lane and kind of look at some of these classes.
Yeah, it can be frustrating though. I mean, like even just a player like Mr. Okoli from Kansas City, went to Auburn, 6'5", 255, defensive lineman.
Yep.
That's just the type of player that you just want to be basically piling on to your recruiting class. Just as many of them as you can get, bring them on. It's kind of like what we talked about when we kind of talked about how the 2022 class is going right now. We're seeing that. We're seeing Missouri just kind of gobble up all these kind of 3-star players who could contribute as upperclassmen. And then they're dipping back into Texas and doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
We'll take all the overlooked 3-star players that you want to give us.
Right.
But
yeah.
Kansas City is a different thing. And you just, man, I don't know. It's just so frustrating to see the in-state players leave. And it's even more frustrating when they're not successful, I think, at where they end up going, because then you're like, man, you might as well have just come to Mizzou,
Yeah.
in that case.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter how it turns out. I could obviously make the argument that they should have come to Mizzou because I'm a homer in that way.
Just a little bit. That's okay. Yeah. I mean that sums it up pretty well. I'm sure there's a name we missed somewhere or at some point, but all of these names kind of come with a story sometimes. And if you guys have seen any of these guys play in high school or anything, if you have any memories about any of these players from some of the older classes, we would love to hear any stories that you have.
Go back before 2012 too. I mean, we had to draw the line somewhere.
Yeah.
We can't go back to infinity. But if you remember any like specific recruiting battles or like guys that you really wanted that we missed on, or maybe players that you were early on thinking, man, I really hope Missouri gets this guy, and they did, mention those in the comments. It's just fun to talk recruiting, and it's so I am so appreciative of these recruiting websites. Not just, people can argue about the actual rankings and the stars and everything, but just having these lists to go back to
Right.
remember kind of what the recruiting landscape was for a given year. It makes it so fun to kind of go back down memory lane a little bit.
Yeah, even just non-Mizzou stuff, like looking at some of the top players in every class, guys that are staples of the NFL now, and it's just crazy to look at their little pictures of them in high school and stuff,
Yeah.
or just see how some of these guys they were just always meant to play football.
Right.
They were a top 10 recruit or whatever in the whole country. Like, of course, they're one of the best running backs in the NFL now. They've always been one of the best players. So
You can go down a rabbit hole and see like all the records they broke as high school players and stuff like that.
Yep. So hopefully 10 years from now, we're looking back on some of these classes very fondly that we're building now.
I think we will be.
I think we will be. We're in a good place.
Oh, yeah.
Cameron, remind the folks how they can join the fantasy football group.
You go to patreon.com/Missouri Sports Pod. Subscribe at the $10 tier or above. It gets you lots of cool stuff. If you stay subscribed to that, you will eventually get merch. You will get access to our Discord channel where we talk Mizzou and where we will probably organize this fantasy football league. But as Kyle alluded to, that first $10 subscription is your entry fee to the fantasy football league. You just have to sign up by August 31st. You will get your spot in the league. If by some miracle we get more than 10 people sign up before August 31st, we'll figure it out. We'll make it work. We'll do a bigger league. We'll expand into 2 leagues. We'll do something to make sure that everybody gets a chance to play. And that'll be a lot of fun.
$10 for a whole season of fantasy football.
Yeah.
Making new friends. Sounds pretty fun.
Winner
to me.
gets a prize, guaranteed. You know, we're not just keeping it all for ourselves, folks. We're giving it back to the community. And it's Missouri Sports Pod. I mean, it's patreon.com/Missouri Sports Pod.
Alrighty. All right, folks. That's all I got for him.
That's all I've got.
All right, you can find us on Spotify, Google Podcasts. We are also on Apple Podcasts. We're on Twitter at Mizzou Sports Pod, and you can email us at MissouriSportsPod@gmail.com.
You can find our t-shirts and stickers on our online shop, MissouriSportsPod.BigCartel.com.
Thank you to our Patreon supporter, Brian Smith, at the $10 and above level.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. We will see you next week.